This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Haig.
Comics are now getting the sort of respect that they never used to command. So you've got Watchmen, you've got Preacher, you've got Sandman, you've got Walking Dead, so you've got the TV series feeding interest in the comics.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
As a boy, I was a devotee of American comic books, and as a middle-aged man, I've seen all 22 of the Marvel superhero films. I think most of us have. But to be honest, I'm a little out of touch with the comic books right now. I'm talking to Joel Meadows, who's written a book called Masters of Comics, which is it's interviews with or looks at comic artists in their workspace and how they work. Joel, how nice of you to talk to me. Hello. I want to talk about who you are to begin with.
Yes.
Because you're quite interesting as well as the book. You run Portsmouth Comic Con.
That's right.
I didn't know there was one in Portsmouth, and there's one in Shrewsbury. And I know the one in XL in London. But Comic Con is what? That's really where I was going with this. Comic Con is what?
Well, in theory, the word Comic Con, well, it's changed. It used to be a place where you'd have comic creators, and it still is that, but you also have the celebrity element now. So you get people from TV and film, like London Film and Comic Con had, I think, David Tennant last year, and the XL show has a lot of celebrities. So it's a comic show, but it also has TV and film elements to it. It has changed. I guess it started because it was an American idea. You know, San Diego and New York now, which gets something like 150,000 people. So it started life as a show about comics, and now it's comics and related areas.
So is that your connection to comics that you do that? Because you've got an online magazine as well. I googled you,
of course.
So you've got an online magazine called Tripwire.
That's right.
And what's Tripwire about?
Tripwire started life as a magazine, as a physical print mag in 1992, where we covered comics and music. We dropped the music out in '99, and we swapped that with film and TV. And we swapped to the web in 2015. So it's comics, film, TV, and the occasional thing that takes my fancy. I'm interested in the illustration as well, and a little bit of art. We try not to veer too much off the subject, but I have slightly broader interests. So I've also worked as a journalist. I used to write for Comic Heroes. I write for Comic Scene. I've done stuff for Full Bleed, which is the IDW magazine, which covers sort of comics and culture. I've written for the Times, Time Magazine, Independent, a lot of other places.
Well, let's look at Masters of Comics. The first thing that strikes you when you look at it is how ravishingly beautiful the art in this is.
Yes.
And for many of us, my background in comic books is, it was all cheap paper, full colour separation, and artists, some of whom were marvellous.
Yes.
But not one of them looked as though they'd been through art school.
Yes.
These days, it's a very different world. The sheer beauty of this is, and I have to say the book is lavishly illustrated.
Yes.
Is quite breathtaking.
Yes. Well, I mean, the thing is, there have always been artists who've worked in comics who have, trained professionally either at art school or they've been working with other artists. Liam Sharp, who isn't in the book, who's a British artist based in the States, he worked under Don Lawrence, who did the Trigon Empire, and he did Storm. So he was, working with him. But as you say, some of them go to art college, some are self-trained, and some others like Jim Lee, who is a very well-known, he's now almost at the very top of DC. He did I believe he went to Harvard, did a psychology degree, rather interesting, and he changed tack to move into art. But a lot of these people, they are professionally trained artists, or they're self-taught. But I guess, has the industry changed? They've always had some very talented artists working in comics, but as you say, the reproduction in the old days, it was a slightly tatty-looking magazine that people would pay 25 or 30 for on a newsstand somewhere. But now, the quality of reproduction, as it is with all kinds of printing, has got a lot better and a lot sharper, and they can really show off these people's work.
And charge a lot more money for it as well.
Yes, significantly more. Yes, the original art is staggering. Like the actual art from some of these comics is incredible. If you wanted to get a piece of original art from some of the not even the very top practitioners, but even the ones who are kind of in the middle, if you like, you're still talking thousands of pounds.
Oh, I always wanted a piece of original art from Jack Kirby, which of course...
Well, now that would cost you thousands.
It's
now,
prohibited.
these days,
not
of
only
course.
that, but my wife wouldn't let me put it up.
Well, no,
so-
of course.
that
No,
would-
exactly.
that would be completely redundant. But the artist... that does... Well, it sort of leads us on to a question, because, of course, a lot of these artists sell their art on. One of them, who was it, who said that he makes half his income out of selling the original art.
Well,
Rather
Sean
than just...
Phillips in the book talks about how he returned to doing physical art because he was doing digital, which is now all on the computer, and he was losing out on that secondary income. So he swapped back to painting. So he now physically paints some of his pieces because he can sell them. And it is a major thing. There are artists, they have fans that come to shows to pick up their work, and it's all well and good, buying a print, but it's not the same as having a physical page or a physical piece.
And some of the artists don't make anything like as much money from selling on their original, but they presumably could if they do that.
Yes.
One of the questions you ask most of your artists is whether they do traditional, with a pen and
Yes.
a piece of pencil, or whether they do it online. I was very interested to find almost all of them said no, traditional methods.
Yes.
My daughter is very good, very good
Okay.
artist, and she does. Yeah, of course, she does with pens and things.
Yes.
and lots on the tablet.
Yes.
I was expecting to find most of these artists in your book doing it digitally,
Yes.
because I've seen what she does. You can get
Oh, you can do
stunning
phenomenal
results.
work. You can
And
do.
yet most of them do go in for a pencil.
Yes. Yes.
and
Yes.
a brush with ink.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think it could have been Lawrence Campbell in the book who said that he likes drawing physically because he likes the mistakes that you make. Because sometimes you make mistakes which enhance the art, whereas if everything is too precise, then you don't get the happy accidents that these artists like to achieve and go, well, actually, that's better than I was hoping it was going to be. Because if you can fix everything, then there's no challenge.
You think the publishers like that?
Well, and I'm sure the publishers aren't that keen on that, but the artists, they enjoy, the challenge and the fact that they can make mistakes, and by fixing those mistakes, they can solve the problem in a more interesting way and get a piece that they're happier with than if they had something which is so precise that if they don't like a line that they create on the computer, they can just go into Photoshop and clone it out or redraw it, and they like that sort of lack of preciseness, if you like. They like the fact that the stuff looks more organic because they've hand drawn it.
One of the things you do is you as well as the illustrations of the pictures of the drawings.
Yes.
You show us either the artist in his workspace or sometimes the workspace with the artist mysteriously missing.
Yes.
What does that tell us though about the artists when we can see where they're working?
Well, I think it has a double purpose actually, because an artist's workspace, it reflects their mindset and reflects the stuff that they enjoy, but it also feeds back into them. So, for example, if they're working and they want reference for something, so they're drawing a specific piece or a specific project, and they go, "Oh, I've always been a big fan of this particular artist," or "I've got these figures," because I think Lawrence Campbell mentions well, he's got figures that he uses for specific reference, so it's there as a very direct influence on the work that they create, and it's also there to create almost, if you like, a comfortable space that they can work in and go, this is my space. Some of these artists spend hours in their studios every day, and they want somewhere that they're happy working in, that they feel that they can express themselves the best in a space that they feel comfortable working in.
And a lot of them is in their home, of course, because that gives you a zero commute, which is great, and you don't have to pay business rates on other premises. For some of them, that must be a drawback, though. I mean, there used to be little studios where 3 or 4 artists would get together, and that must be you'd think that would be a sort of a nurturing, creative space.
Well, some artists do still work outside. Frank Quitely, who's in the book, he worked in a very small space with 2 other artists in Glasgow, and his space is, I would say, half the size of my lounge.
Oh, but he's particularly tiny.
Yes, I mean, he used to have another space in his Hope Street studios, but he works on a Wacom, on a tablet, but he's very, very precise, and it's amazing. He can create this phenomenal. He used to, I think he used to draw physically, and he switched. I mean, he's had some health concerns. Unfortunately, he had very bad sciatica, because a lot of these artists have spent hours sitting, and it does terrible things to your back.
You need one of those Fitbits to tell you to get up and walk around the room every hour.
So he has a tiny space. Conversely, Walt Simonson is in his house. He has a beautiful workspace. Will Simpson did have 2 different studios, but he lost them because they sold the house, so he's now working from home. But it really varies. Some people have a tiny workspace. Sean Phillips has a very nice, it's sort of like an extension to his house, and he's got loads of movie posters and lots of really lovely books around it. So it really varies. It depends. I guess they sometimes suit their workspace to suit their work patterns and the way that they work.
You talk about Frank Whiteley there. That brings me to another thing that strikes me, and that's how fantastically slow this process is.
Yes.
John Paul Leon says a 20-page book, it will take him 8 weeks to pencil and ink, which is to do, the pencil and,
exactly.
and then ink over it so you can reproduce
yes.
it. Frank Whiteley, 2 pages a week. In a week, Jack Kirby would have done 3 20-page books. Now, they weren't as elaborate.
Yes.
Of course, and he was unbelievably quick. But back then,
yes,
artists worked much more. I mean, these guys would starve to death working for Stan Lee.
No, that's very true. I mean, they have to... Things have changed. I mean, Sean Phillips can do... I think he can do 2 books a month, I think. So we can definitely do at least 1 book a month. He's quicker. He's a much faster artist, but... I guess things have changed. Frank Whiteley is very in demand, and he mainly just does covers now, and he does variant covers. He doesn't do tons of interiors, and when he does work, he's very well paid for it, deservedly so, because he's a phenomenal artist.
But being well paid for it is also an innovation. It's also something that
it's changed. And also, yes,
50 years ago, it was extremely badly paid.
Oh no,
it
was almost like working in a sweatshop.
Despised...
people would get paid a pittance, and they'd have to, as you say, have to turn things around very fast. But if you look at things like books, I mean, if I'm right, I think Michael Moorcock used to write a novel a week when he was writing Elric and some of his other fantasy novels, because he had. Well, he got into a rhythm, and I don't know. He was able to turn stuff out really, really fast.
Like Simenon used to do a novel in 3 weeks.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, as you say, they didn't have the luxury back then of being able to work slowly, but now, because the industry has changed so much, and people like Frank Quitely, as well as comics, they do illustration. I mean, Quitely, there was the very first exhibition, had an exhibition of his art at the Kelvin Grove, which I was lucky enough to go around with him. I guess it would have been a couple of years ago, and the Kelvin Grove is the most prestigious art gallery in Glasgow, and it had a massive room dedicated to his work, and it just shows that comics are now getting the sort of respect that they never used to command, even from the mainstream art world. And it's really interesting to look at that. I went to a Robert Crumb exhibition at this place in Mayfair about 2 or 3 years ago, and it's one of these things where you go back 10 to 15 years before that, and they wouldn't even let him through the door.
Yeah.
And now there's all these pieces of his work. So the people's perception, even people that didn't consider comics to be proper art, it's changed so dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years, really.
It must have a big impact, though, on the economics of it. Comics must be much more expensive, and of course they have these graphic novels,
yes,
which somebody once said it's a big comic.
Yes.
But if you are going to be doing 2 pages a week,
yes,
then presumably there has to be a much higher price on the finished product.
Well, you mean the actual things that people purchase?
Yeah,
I mean,
if
you see yourself, comics are sort of £3 or £4 each now, whereas in the old days they would have been
12 cents
exactly, or 50p or 75p, or
I bought one on eBay,
yes,
an old Defenders comic,
yes,
which has a particularly good cover,
yes,
which was I think 12 cents, and it had been brought out, and it had 4p.
Yes, exactly,
written on the front,
yes,
in felt pen.
Yes,
because that's what it was when they brought it over.
Yes, but no, I mean it has changed. The economics have changed in the last few years. But I mean, these people, they supplement their income with other work. So Frank Quitely's done illustration work. He worked with Grant Morrison on a Robbie Williams album, which is obviously higher paid than the comic job when he did a Grant Morrison portrait. I think that was for Playboy. And these other people like Sean Phillips. The other thing that's interesting about these artists is that a lot of them do work which is, creator owned. In the old days, the companies owned everything. And now Sean Phillips works with an American writer called Ed Brubaker, and they are exclusive to Image, the company that publishes them. And I think at least 1 or 2 of them things have been picked up for TV. And so they're able to sort of steer their own destiny now. and they own all of this stuff. So when trades and paper, reprints come out, they get royalties on that, and they get a much better deal than they would have done in the old days when they got just a very basic royalty, and then the company would take the lion's share of the money in terms of profit.
Do they sell big though? I remember in the 80s, people got very excited when Frank Miller's Daredevil and Chris Claremont's X-Men were moving like 600,000 copies a month. Now that seemed to me pretty big numbers.
Yes.
Are we still in that?
No. To be honest, the biggest books sell now. I mean, it's a fraction of that. The biggest books sell between sort of 60 to 80,000 a month. It has shrunk, but then you've got the graphic novel market when you can get a graphic novel which can be selling as much as, say, 10,000 copies a month. I mean, something like Watchmen.
I was going to say Watchmen is just behind you.
Yes, it's constantly back in print. And I remember hearing that when the run up to the film, apparently that sold 1 million copies in paperback.
Holy cow!
And they're doing a new printing of that, I think, this month because there's the TV series starting later in the year. So there are these cash cows. So you've got Watchmen, you've got Preacher, you've got Sandman, you've got Walking Dead, obviously, which is a massive phenomena. So you've got the TV series feeding interest in the comics.
Have the the Avengers type movies had any impact on?
Well, probably on graphic novels, not on monthlies. Monthlies they're fairly static. Both DC and Marvel, they seem to trying to come up with different ways to get people to pick up their titles, but they are. The numbers have plateaued. They're not a fraction of the kind of numbers you were talking about, but they've got the graphic novel market, which they can sell into bookshops or comic shops or Amazon, and these things can be perennial sellers. So, you've got Panini putting out Marvel reprints, and, DC have a huge backlist of their own graphic novels. So these books, these are the backbone of their titles. And Image, Walking Dead, I seem to remember reading that sold something like between 10 and 15,000 copies a month. And that's the trade paperback, which is a 15 to 20 pound collection rather than a £3 comic. And these things are constantly in print. And, if people pick up the new one, that they'll want the good chance to pick up the older titles. So they have, God knows how many trades there must be. There must be over 20 Walking Dead trades. And they all these companies, they survive in their backlist as book publishers used to do. So the model has changed a lot for comics. So graphic novels probably bring in more money. In some ways, the monthlies and the comics they produce are almost like a loss leader for the companies. Was
there anybody that you wanted in the book that you didn't get? I know this is actually a sequel, isn't it? There was a previous
a follow-up. There was a book studio space.
For instance, Frank Miller isn't in
he was in the first one.
He was in the first one.
It was more of a challenge. He proved to be impossible to get for the second one. We got him for the first. Howard Chaykin, who's quite a well-known American comic creator, sort of changed his mind. He decided not to be in. He's in the first one, but he decided not to be in the second. There were people who just didn't sort of quite work out, but I think we have got a good mix, and we've got a good mix of different people from different eras, sort of slightly more veteran artists and more modern art. Exactly. Sienkiewicz we couldn't get for the first one because he proved hard to pin down, but we got him for the new one, which I'm very pleased about.
And I was going to ask about Dave Gibbons, but he's
in the first one. Yes.
Neil Adams, did you?
Neil Adams is a difficult man to deal with. So I think we didn't even consider him for either of the books. But he would have been great, but it just didn't. I just don't think it would have worked. I tried to get Mobius for the first book.
Oh, right.
But that didn't really happen. That was problematic. Obviously, he's no longer with us, but he was alive when we put the first book together. But it was too challenging, to be honest, to come to an arrangement with his wife, sadly. So that didn't happen with the first book.
I'm going to ask an invidious question.
Yes,
do you have a favourite?
For either book or first?
In Masters of Comics. Yeah.
Well, it's hard to pick. I'm very proud that
Don't you say Marshall Rogers and he's not in either.
No, I'm very proud that I got Sienkiewicz because I've always been a huge fan of him as an artist, and I'm glad I got to pin him down. I mean, Walt Simonson is a friend of mine, so I'm pleased I got him. He's in both of those. Mm-hmm. I'm very proud. There isn't a chapter that I go, they're there just as a space filler. I think there's 22 artists, and I think they all serve a particular purpose.
And even as far as Posey Simmons, who you don't think of so much as a...
Well,
of course she is.
I like to have her in there just to mix it up a bit, and because she comes from a different discipline, and because she comes from illustration and from newspapers rather than comics, but...
And also because she's marvellous.
Well, she's fabulously talented. And also British as well. That was the thing I wanted.
Quite a lot of British artists. I mean, there was a time when it was Barry Windsor Smith, and that was...
No, there's a lot. This country has changed a lot. There's a lot of very talented... I mean, there was Sean Phillips in both of those, Lawrence Campbell in that, Duncan Fagredo's in the first one, Chris
Frank
Weston.
Whiteley,
of course, yeah, he's very incredibly talented, So,
is there a best format for comic for this art to be displayed? I'm thinking, is it in the sort of individual one on the monthly? Is it in the graphic novel? Is it on the wall? How's the best way?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think it is nice to see them in graphic novels because the production of those it's a lot stronger and it's a lot better than it used to be. So you can, I mean, what is nice, the way to see this stuff, and it's not cheap, and not everyone can afford to do it, is actually buying the IDW, the artist editions, which are these oversized, which I've got a huge pile of those. Yeah, they are, but they do, in terms of reproduction, and the closest you can get to actually having the original art without having to pay thousands of pounds. But they're not cheap, but they do give you a flavour of how the art looked when they're sent through to the publisher or the editor.
But is that the best way to look at it? I mean, because that art was made to be,
of course,
reproduced as a comic book. It was made to be inked in and coloured in, and all of that. So it's a question.
I suppose
in fact, it is the question.
Yes. Well, I suppose it depends on how you want to appreciate these things. It depends if you're a reader or whether you're an art aficionado. If you're an art aficionado, then probably something like the artist editions is a good.
And you like to get under the bonnet. You like to.
Oh, I do. Yes, I do. I find it fascinating. I've always been interested in it. You saw in the first book, I got to visit Joe Kubert, which was fascinating. I got to go to the Kubert School and interview, and I spent. Frank Miller.
He's not with us still.
Sadly, he died in 2006. I think no, 2010 or 12. It was a few years ago. So sadly, but I do feel lucky that I got to visit him at the school and talk to him. So no, I feel, I mean, sadly in that book, Steve Dillon is no longer with us either. He used to draw for 2000 AD and he started Deadline and he co-created Preacher, and sadly he died about 2 or 3 years ago. And Sergio Toppi was another very talented Italian artist. He went. So what's slightly sad is to look at the first book and realise that 3 or 4 of the subjects are no longer with us, but that's sort of the nature of the beast, I suppose.
I was interested in how many of the artists I don't know.
Yes.
Some of them, of course, I did.
Yes.
If I was going to go back into the comic book store and say, because I have been deeply impressed with how lovely the drawing. Where would I start? Who should I look at?
Well, I guess the question is, what do you like to read as a reader in terms of what subject, what genre do you enjoy?
It was always the American comics when I was a kid, so the superheroes was always the thing.
Yes.
And that would probably be the way back in if I wanted to pick it up.
I mean, there are some strong superhero books. I mean, I guess that Brian Bendis, who used to work for Marvel, swapped to DC, and he's now writing Action Comics and Superman, and they're quite fun books because he's got quite a good grasp of the characters. When I was a kid, I used to read DC Comics Presents and Superman and Action Comics, so I used to read the Superman books. I mean, Tom King's doing quite a good job of the Batman book at the moment. If you like superheroes, he's been on it. Is a great character. For about the last 3 or 4 years. Really. So he's done a good job. So that would be a good start. And you could pick up probably the first couple of trades that he's written. I mean, are there any other genres that you enjoy apart from superheroes, would you say? I was never
much for the there are lots of graphic novels where people think that they're making the genre grow up.
Yes.
So there's a lot of people standing around.
There's never really your cup of tea.
Yeah,
I mean, what about crime stuff, for example? Do you like, or is it not really your thing?
Not especially. I mean, I liked the Frank Miller Sin City stuff.
I mean, if you like Miller's stuff, I mean, Eduardo Rizzo, who is in the book, did this series called 100 Bullets with Brian Azzarello, which is a very strong series, which finished. I think there are 10 or 12 trades. That might be good. And actually, another book, the artist is not in the book, a series called Scalped, which is basically a guy who's a Native American who goes undercover with sort of different criminals. He's an FBI agent, and that's actually a great series. That would make a great TV show, and that was done by Jason Aaron and drawn by a guy called R.M. Guerra, who's, I believe, he's Croatian, but he lives in Spain. I'd recommend that because if you think about what you enjoy watching on TV, if you like crime stuff or stuff like that or detective series, then these are the equivalent, if you like, but just on the page.
Joel, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
That's Joel Meadows, Masters of Comics. It's Insight.
Indeed. It's available from the 4th of June, officially published.
On the back it says $24.99. I think there's a hardback, is there, as well?
No, it was originally planned to be a hardback, but it's coming out in paperback. And there will be, shameless plug, if people are based in London, there's a signing for the book on the 15th of June at Gosh in Soho with Posey Simmons, Lawrence Campbell and Sean Phillips. And there might be a Waterstone signing in July, but
sounds
I'm
like
not
fun.
quite sure about that. But yeah, so if people are London-based, they're welcome to come along. But it will be available from.
They're welcome
from
to fly
bookshops.
in as well.
Well,
aren't
they can do that as
Jack?
well. Of course, they're more than welcome to come from far and wide. So, but yeah, if they're around on the 15th of June, and if any of your listeners are US-based, we have a event on, I think, the 3rd of October at the Society of Illustrators in New York with 2 or 3 of the artists from the book and myself. So if anyone is New York-based or East Coast-based and they're around and fancy coming to a talk, they'd be more than welcome to that as well.
Good plan. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.